In the high-stakes world of global trade, a new battlefield has emerged, one that could determine who controls the future of healthcare technology. It's not being fought with missiles or sanctions alone, but with procurement rules, market restrictions, and billion-dollar investments in cutting-edge medical equipment. For years, the European Union has watched China's technological rise with growing unease. From semiconductors to electric vehicles, Chinese companies have been climbing the value chain, challenging Western dominance in industries once considered untouchable. But now, the confrontation has reached an unexpected front: medical devices. The machines that scan our bodies, diagnose our diseases, and save our lives have become the latest flashpoint in an escalating economic war between two of the world's largest trading blocs. On June 20th, 2024, the European Commission made a decisive move. They announced sweeping restrictions that would effectively bar Chinese companies from competing for major medical device contracts across the EU. Any public tender exceeding €5 million would now be off-limits to Chinese firms. Even when Chinese companies managed to secure smaller projects, their participation would be capped at just 50% of the contract value. The message was clear. Europe was drawing a red line to protect its medical technology sector from Chinese competition, but Beijing wasn't about to accept this quietly. Within weeks, China fired back with countermeasures of its own, restricting European medical device imports and government procurement projects exceeding 45 million yuan. What followed was a tit-for-tat exchange that has sent shockwaves through the global healthcare industry, affecting billions of dollars in trade and raising profound questions about the future of medical technology. This is the story of how China went from being the world's biggest buyer of Western medical equipment to becoming a formidable competitor, and how that transformation triggered a trade war that could reshape healthcare for billions of people around the globe. To understand this conflict, we need to rewind the clock about 15 years. China in the early 2010s was a medical technology desert. Despite being home to more than 1.3 billion people, roughly one-fifth of humanity, the country had virtually no capacity to produce sophisticated medical equipment. Walk into any major Chinese hospital, and you'd find the corridors filled with machines bearing familiar Western brand names: Siemens from Germany, GE Healthcare from the United States, Philips from the Netherlands. The scale of China's healthcare needs was staggering. By 2014, Chinese hospitals were recording nearly 3 billion patient visits annually. That's roughly 2.65 billion in public hospitals and another 330 million in private facilities. To put that in perspective, that's more than 8 patient visits for every single person in the country each year. With such massive demand came an equally massive market for medical devices. By 2019, China's medical equipment market had ballooned to over 200 billion yuan, growing at a relentless pace of 4 to 7% annually. The country was on track to become one of the world's largest healthcare markets. But here's the problem. China couldn't make what it needed: high-end diagnostic equipment, the MRI scanners, CT machines, and advanced imaging systems that form the backbone of modern medicine were almost entirely imported. In 2019 alone, China spent $26.78 billion on imported medical devices, a year-over-year increase of more than 20%. The European Union was one of the biggest beneficiaries, exporting approximately $3 billion worth of medical equipment to China every single year. By 2024, European medical devices would account for roughly 35% of the entire Chinese market, concentrated heavily in the most profitable segments: advanced imaging equipment, cardiovascular devices, and precision surgical tools. For Chinese hospitals and patients, this dependency came at a brutal cost. A single high-end MRI machine, the kind used for routine physical examinations in developed countries, could cost tens of millions of dollars. For a country where rural incomes in some regions barely matched what an American waiter might earn in a month, these prices were devastating. Chinese healthcare administrators faced an impossible choice: either purchase prohibitively expensive foreign equipment and pass the costs on to patients, or go without the advanced diagnostic tools that could save lives. This wasn't just an economic problem, it was a matter of national pride and public health. China's leadership recognized that relying so heavily on foreign medical technology was both financially unsustainable and strategically dangerous. If geopolitical tensions ever escalated, Western countries could cut off access to critical healthcare equipment, leaving Chinese hospitals unable to care for their own people. The solution seemed obvious. China needed to develop its own medical technology industry, but the execution would prove far more challenging than anyone imagined. In the early 2010s, Chinese engineers faced a daunting reality. The technology gap between China and the West in medical devices wasn't measured in years, it was measured in decades. Take magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI, as an example. These machines rely on superconducting magnets cooled to near absolute zero, radio frequency systems that can detect signals from individual hydrogen atoms in the human body, and sophisticated software algorithms that transform raw data into the detailed images doctors use to diagnose everything from torn ligaments to brain tumors. China's manufacturing capabilities at the time were simply not advanced enough to produce such equipment. The country could manufacture toys, textiles, and consumer electronics, but precision medical engineering required a completely different level of expertise. Undeterred, the Chinese government launched a national initiative, calling on researchers, engineers, and scientists from across the country to participate in a medical technology independence program. The goal was ambitious: develop world-class medical equipment that could compete with Western products on quality while being affordable enough for Chinese hospitals to actually purchase. For years, progress was slow and frustrating. Engineers worked on reverse engineering imported equipment, studying every component, every circuit, every line of code. They faced countless setbacks and technical challenges that seemed insurmountable. Then, in 2015, came the breakthrough. Chinese engineers at United Imaging Healthcare unveiled the country's first domestically produced 3.0 Tesla MRI machine, a device they called the UMR 770. What made this achievement remarkable wasn't just that it worked, but that it was built almost entirely from Chinese-made components. The engineering team had mastered precision winding technology for superconducting magnets, a closely guarded secret that Western companies had monopolized for decades. They designed their own gradient coils through independent research and development. Perhaps most impressively, they adopted liquid helium-free cooling technology, which reduced operating costs by more than 25% compared to conventional systems. The machine held 124 core patents, all Chinese. In terms of imaging quality, it matched or exceeded international standards in critical metrics like signal-to-noise ratio and scanning speed. Doctors using the equipment reported that the images were as clear and detailed as anything they'd seen from Western machines. But the real game-changer was the price. Chinese-made MRI machines cost only 60 to 70% of what hospitals paid for imported equipment. For Chinese hospitals, this meant procurement costs could be slashed by as much as 76%. Suddenly, advanced diagnostic imaging became accessible to second-tier cities and regional hospitals that could never have afforded Western equipment. The implications were profound. For the first time, China wasn't just consuming medical technology, it was producing it. With a proven product and a massive domestic market, Chinese medical device companies began looking beyond their borders. In 2017, backed by supportive government policies, Chinese manufacturers started targeting international markets. Their pitch was compelling: equipment that matched Western quality at a fraction of the price. For developing countries struggling to build modern healthcare systems, the value proposition was irresistible. India became an early testing ground. Apollo Hospitals Group, one of India's largest healthcare providers, began canceling some of its traditional import orders from Western suppliers and switching to Chinese equipment. The cost savings were simply too significant to ignore, and the performance was meeting clinical needs. Chinese companies weren't content to rest on their achievements. They continued investing heavily in research and development, pushing the boundaries of what their technology could do. By 2023, they achieved another milestone: the world's first 5.0 Tesla MRI machine. This wasn't just an incremental improvement. It represented a quantum leap in capability. The higher magnetic field strength enabled faster scanning times and dramatically improved image clarity, allowing doctors to detect abnormalities that might have been invisible on older equipment. Once again, the international medical community took notice. More significantly, Chinese manufacturers had finally cracked the European market. Europe had always been a tough nut to crack for Chinese technology companies. European regulators enforced strict quality standards, and European hospitals had long-standing relationships with trusted Western suppliers. But the combination of competitive pricing, improving quality, and aggressive marketing began to pay off. By 2024, the numbers told a remarkable story. China's total medical device exports to the European Union had reached $9 billion, a 12% increase from the previous year. More importantly, Chinese equipment now held 18.5% of the European medical device market, up from virtually nothing just a few years earlier. This growth trajectory set off alarm bells in European boardrooms. Industry analysts began running projections. If Chinese manufacturers continued expanding at this rate, they could potentially capture 80% or more of the European medical equipment market within a decade. For established European companies like Siemens Healthineers, Philips Healthcare, and smaller specialized manufacturers, this was an existential threat. These companies had dominated the global medical device industry for generations, relying on their reputation for quality and their established relationships with hospitals and healthcare systems worldwide. Now, they faced a competitor that could match their technology at prices they simply couldn't compete with. The traditional advantages of European manufacturers, engineering excellence, brand reputation, regulatory approval, were being systematically eroded. European industry groups began lobbying their governments for protection. They argued that Chinese companies benefited from state subsidies, favorable financing, and an unfair competitive advantage that had nothing to do with genuine innovation or market efficiency. They demanded action to level the playing field. European policymakers listened. The European Union's international procurement instrument had actually been in development for over a decade. First proposed in 2012, it wasn't officially enacted until June of 2022. The legislation was designed with a seemingly reasonable goal: making sure that European companies had fair and reciprocal access to government procurement markets in other countries. But in practice, the IPI gave the EU some pretty powerful tools to restrict or even penalize foreign companies bidding on public contracts. Under this framework, the Commission could directly prohibit companies from certain countries from participating in large-scale procurement projects. Alternatively, they could impose punitive adjustments, automatically increasing a foreign company's bid price by, say, 10 to 20%, which would ensure they'd be at a severe competitive disadvantage. For 2 years after the IPI's enactment, it actually remained relatively dormant. Then, on June 20, 2024, the European Commission made its move, deploying the instrument specifically against Chinese medical device manufacturers. The restrictions were sweeping. Chinese companies would be barred from participating in any medical device tender exceeding 5 million euros. Even when Chinese firms managed to win smaller contracts, their participation would be capped at 50% of the project value. If European companies subcontracted any work to Chinese partners, those subcontracts couldn't exceed half the total contract. The official justification was reciprocity. The EU claimed it was simply responding to restrictions that China placed on European companies in Chinese procurement. But honestly, the timing and targeting suggested something more. This was a strategic move to halt Chinese advances in a critical technology sector. Chinese officials were quick to denounce the decision. Ministry of Commerce spokespersons accused the EU of hypocrisy,
pointing out that Europe had long positioned itself as the world's most open and free market, yet was now moving aggressively toward trade protectionism. They characterized the restrictions as classic double standards, demanding free access to Chinese markets while closing European markets to Chinese competition.
More importantly, Chinese leaders viewed this as part of a broader pattern of coordinated Western efforts to contain China's technological and economic rise. Whether in semiconductors, telecommunications, electric vehicles, or now medical devices, the strategy seemed pretty consistent. Whenever Chinese companies began competing effectively in high-value industries, Western countries moved to restrict their access. Beijing's response was swift and calculated. Act 5. China's Counterstrike. On July 6, 2024, just about 2 weeks after the EU's announcement, China released its own countermeasure list. The Chinese government announced new restrictive measures, specifically targeting European medical devices and government procurement activities. Any procurement project with a budget exceeding 45 million yuan, which is roughly 6.2 million euros, would now face fresh limitations on the purchase of European equipment. But, China's approach wasn't just a simple tit-for-tat ban. The restrictions were actually quite carefully calibrated to achieve several objectives at once. First off, these measures only applied to new procurement activities. Chinese hospitals and medical institutions were being discouraged from buying European medical devices valued above 45 million yuan. This threshold was no accident. It was strategically chosen to target high-end equipment, the very segment where European manufacturers held their strongest competitive edge and earned their biggest margins. That said, China also built in some exceptions. If a procurement project genuinely required equipment that only European manufacturers could provide, if no domestic or alternative foreign product could meet the technical or clinical needs, then the 45 million yuan restriction simply wouldn't apply. In those cases, Chinese institutions could still go ahead and purchase European equipment, even if the amount was above the threshold. This exception served a couple of important purposes. First, it recognized that Chinese manufacturers hadn't quite caught up with European companies across every product category. Second, it created a strong incentive for Chinese firms to accelerate their development efforts. Every time a hospital claimed that only European equipment could meet their needs, it basically highlighted a gap that domestic manufacturers needed to fill. The second major restriction focused on mixed procurement projects. If a contract involved suppliers from multiple countries, say bidders from China, the United States, Japan, and the EU, then the total purchase value of EU medical devices couldn't exceed 50% of the project's total value. This set a clear red line, making sure that when alternatives existed, non-European equipment would be given priority consideration. The impact on European medical device manufacturers was, immediate and pretty severe. Siemens Healthineers, one of Europe's flagship medical technology companies, found itself especially vulnerable. Many of their most advanced products, like photon-counting CT scanners, 7 Tesla MRI machines, and other cutting-edge diagnostic tools, came with price tags well above China's procurement threshold. These were exactly the kinds of high-margin products that had been sustaining the company's profitability. Philips Healthcare and other major European manufacturers faced similar challenges. Industry analysts estimated that European companies stood to lose at least $500 million in annual market share as a direct result of China's countermeasures. And that's just the immediate hit. If these restrictions stayed in place for years, the cumulative losses could easily run into the billions. For European executives, this situation created a real strategic dilemma. China represented one of the world's largest and fastest-growing healthcare markets. Walking away would mean giving up potential revenue worth billions, but staying competitive under these new restrictions would require some pretty fundamental changes to their business models. Act 6. The Scramble for Alternatives. Faced with shrinking access to the Chinese market, European medical device companies began searching for alternative growth strategies. Some companies started looking to emerging markets in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, regions with expanding healthcare budgets and, honestly, less geopolitical baggage. Interestingly, Mindray Medical, which is actually a Chinese firm, had already begun setting up new subsidiaries in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, recognizing the big opportunities in Gulf countries that are investing heavily in healthcare infrastructure. Meanwhile, Chinese manufacturers like United Imaging Healthcare began targeting markets in Central and Eastern Europe. Hungary and Serbia, for example, became focal points for expansion, with Chinese companies offering competitive deals that included not just medical equipment sales, but also broader economic partnerships and development assistance. European manufacturers, on their side, also explored ways to shore up their competitive position without relying solely on market access. Some started emphasizing enhanced service models, strengthening local technical support, equipment maintenance, and user training programs. The logic here was pretty straightforward. While Chinese companies might match them on hardware, European firms could stand out through superior after-sales service and long-term customer relationships. Take minimally invasive surgical robots as an example. While Chinese companies were starting to develop competitive products in this space, the installed base was still relatively small. European companies figured that by building robust local service networks, they could create switching costs, making hospitals reluctant to change suppliers even if Chinese alternatives became available. Other European manufacturers considered strategic partnerships with Chinese firms as a way to maintain market access. If they couldn't beat Chinese competitors, maybe they could join them, combining European engineering expertise with Chinese manufacturing efficiency and local market knowledge. But, all these strategies came with significant trade-offs and uncertainties. Pivoting to new markets required years of relationship building and regulatory approvals. Service differentiation only worked as long as the underlying product quality stayed competitive. And partnerships with Chinese firms risked transferring the very technologies and expertise that still gave Europe its competitive edge. Act 7. China's Technological Maturation. What makes China's rise in medical devices truly remarkable isn't just the speed of its advancement, it's really the comprehensiveness of the transformation. Chinese companies didn't just copy Western products and sell them for less. They've started developing their own technical standards and pushing the boundaries of innovation in ways that are now earning international recognition. Several core technical parameters developed by Chinese medical device manufacturers have actually been officially incorporated into international industry standard systems. This is a pretty fundamental shift. China is no longer just following standards set by Western companies and regulators. It's now helping write the standards that everyone else has to follow. And maybe even more significantly, Chinese-developed AI-assisted diagnostic algorithms have successfully passed both FDA certification in the United States and CE marking in Europe. These are some of the world's toughest regulatory approvals, and getting them means demonstrating not just safety, but real clinical effectiveness. This kind of regulatory success has profound implications. It means that Western healthcare authorities have formally acknowledged that Chinese medical technology has reached a level of international credibility and comparability. Chinese medical devices aren't just cheaper alternatives for developing countries anymore. They're now legitimate options for the world's most demanding healthcare systems. The technological foundation behind this achievement runs pretty deep. Chinese universities have massively expanded their biomedical engineering programs over the past decade. Today, the country graduates more biomedical engineers every year than the United States and Europe combined. A lot of these graduates have studied or worked abroad, bringing back expertise from leading Western institutions and companies. Chinese companies have also invested heavily in fundamental research, moving well beyond reverse engineering into genuine innovation. They're exploring new imaging modalities, developing novel diagnostic approaches, and pushing into areas like precision medicine and personalized healthcare, the real future of the industry. The government has supported these efforts with substantial funding, but increasingly, private investment is driving innovation as well. Chinese venture capital firms and private equity investors have poured billions into medical technology startups, creating a vibrant ecosystem of innovation that now rivals what you see in Silicon Valley or Boston's biotech corridor. Act 8. The broader implications. The EU-China medical device conflict is about a lot more than MRI machines and CT scanners. It's really a microcosm of a much larger economic and technological competition that's going to shape the 21st century. For decades, the global economy operated on a relatively clear division of labor. Western countries, mainly in North America and Europe, specialized in high-value, technology-intensive industries. They designed and manufactured advanced products, from aircraft to pharmaceuticals to medical devices. Developing countries, including China, focused on lower-value manufacturing, assembling products designed elsewhere, and exporting raw materials or low-tech goods. This arrangement benefited Western economies enormously. They captured most of the value in global supply chains, maintained technological leadership, and enjoyed the high-paying jobs that came with advanced manufacturing.